Black Ops 1 was the first Call of Duty game that took place outside of the World War II setting, and it really reveled in that Cold War time frame. So, after the very American Zombies map where you literally play as a US president, of course they had to head to the other side of the war and take a look at the Russian side of things. And so, the first DLC map released for Black Ops was the Soviet Cosmodrome, Ascension.
Please, help me. She's coming. The mechanism must be repaired.
There's no point in wasting any time talking around it. The big story of Ascension was the fact that it had the first mainline Easter egg in the Zombies mode, the Casimir mechanism. In the video on Derice, I of course mentioned the fly trap, but that was more of just a prototype of where Easter eggs would eventually end up. It was really just a super basic scavenger hunt. This one in Ascension, had consequences for the story, and started jumping into having those really bizarre, obscure, convoluted steps that we would grow to both love and hate, like pixel hunting on every surface to try and find these tiny buttons, or throwing equipment outside the map at random flashing lights to trigger one step. Then, at the end of it all, the reward was a death machine for every player that lasted 90 seconds instead of the standard 30. Personally, I actually don't mind this at all. Obviously, later in the series it would be normal to pick up a couple special weapons along the way of completing the egg, and then by the time you finished you would probably get something like all the perks on the map, but I really like the idea of Ascension where no one was doing it for a practical reward. We were all doing it because they put a puzzle in front of us and we all wanted to solve it and say we had done it. Over time, a lot of the instant gratification mechanics from the multiplayer side of things have leaked into Zombies, but back then it was a very self-driven experience. The only reason to keep playing was because you wanted to do better, you wanted to get to a higher round, and you wanted to see what else the map had to offer. It was all internally motivated. There wasn't anything to grind for, there was literally nothing that carried over between games. It was a very pure experience where each game you started out from zero and you played because it was fun. It wasn't because you wanted to get anything else out of it. That philosophy is key to Ascension, down to small things like the theme song of the map having multiple riddles as part of the lyrics. It's all about that spirit of just solving puzzles. The story of Ascension told by that Easter egg and by the other radios in the map was a very familiar one. It was the story of a Soviet research division where the head scientist, Gersh, assigned his subordinate, Yuri Zavoysky, into an area of research that he wasn't interested in. Yuri, frustrated, came into contact with Element 115 and began to hear voices in his head, and eventually betrayed Gersh and tried to kill his superior. This story of betrayal between two scientists is almost a perfect parallel to the story of Derice with Maxis and Richtofen. The key difference there is that Yuri wasn't hearing vague, unspecified, schizophrenic voices in his head like Richtofen was. He was very specifically hearing the voice of Samantha Maxis telling him to kill. It was obvious now that Sam was the main antagonist, as she would be for all of the Black Ops 1 maps. We were starting to see the ramifications of what Richtofen did at Derice. Gameplay-wise, there was one other big revolution in Ascension. We got new perks available for purchase for the first time since the original 4 perks introduction back in Verrückt. We actually got 2 new ones in this same map. Double Tap actually doesn't appear, but they added 2 new ones, bringing the total available on Ascension up to 5, at least before Mule Kick was patched into all the maps retroactively, which we'll get to later. Interestingly, they still only let you buy 4 of them, meaning you had to start making some choices about your perk loadout. See, in Verrückt, it wasn't that there was a 4 perk limit, it was just that there were 4 perks. You could buy everything available to you. There was never any concept of limitation. Ascension was where that very intentional decision was made to start putting limitations on the player to prevent them from getting too overpowered, and also to start making them think about how exactly they wanted to spec out their character. That restriction made it so that instead of everyone inevitably ending up with the same perk setup, players could choose to focus on different things that were important to them and feel different from game to game. So the first new perk was Stamina, which both increased your movement speed and gave you more stamina to allow you to run for longer. It was a nice convenience because the map was pretty big, especially during the monkey rounds when you're trying to get from point A to point B as fast as possible. The real star of the show, though, was PhD Flopper. It was named after the ability it gave you to dolphin dive and create an explosion around where you land, but way more importantly, it made you invincible to all self-inflicted damage, like the explosions from your own explosive weapons. This perk single-handedly invented a new meta for the entire mode. If you grab PhD and also carry an explosive weapon like the Mustang and Sally or an upgraded ray gun, if you're ever cornered, you can just shoot at your feet and kill all the zombies around you while you take no damage. This made it basically automatic to get to rounds like 25 and 30, because you basically were in no danger until that explosive damage started falling off and not being able to kill the zombies as fast as they could hit you. It was 100% pretty overpowered, and Treyarch realized that and started phasing it out in just a couple maps, but while it lasted, this perk felt incredible. Of course, talking about perks, on Ascension, we have to mention the Space Monkeys. Following in the tradition of 5, this map replaced the Hellhound rounds with something totally new. Every 5-ish rounds, a group of monkeys would spawn around the map and primarily target perk machines. If they did enough damage to a machine, any players who had bought that perk would lose it, and they would have to rebuy it if they wanted to get those effects again. Like the Pentagon Thief in 5, there were degrees of success to these rounds. You would always get a max ammo, but if you as a team managed to kill every single monkey before any single one did any damage to a perk machine, you would also get a new drop that rewarded every player with a perk that they didn't already own for free. If you had a full 4 already, this was actually the only way to get around that 4 perk limit, as it would give you one extra. The monkeys weren't a real threat. It was frustrating to lose a perk, but you could fairly easily guard 2 or 3 and then just pay the couple thousand points it takes to rebuy that last one. The real interesting thing that they represented was the designers trying to prompt players not to camp, to move around the map and split up from each other. Convincing the players to move to opposite ends of a map that at the time was relatively very big was a way to ratchet up the tension by removing the safety net of feeling like you could always just be revived. When you're alone and you might fully bleed out before anyone can get to you, you have to play a lot more carefully. It wasn't perfect because they were contained to their own rounds, so you could fairly easily split off for the monkey rounds and then meet back together before the next round started. But in upcoming maps, you'll see a recurring theme of game elements that try to incentivize the players to move around. To get subjective for a second, I personally don't love Ascension. I think my problem with it is that even though it did do all of this really interesting stuff, in the end it just feels a little bland. It's not bad in any way, it just feels like it doesn't have anything to really set it apart and make it special. That starts at a visual level. Until you turn the power on, the whole game has a black and white filter over it, a nice homage to those 50s Cold War era science fiction films that inspired the campy zombies lore. The problem is that when you do turn the power on, it really doesn't change all that much. It's still not very colorful or visually interesting. Even though the color is available, the whole map is still built out of concrete and gray steel. On top of that, during the monkey rounds, the map would get saturated with these deep oranges and reds, and then at the end of those rounds, when you went back to the normal view, it looked dull just in comparison. It's a really minor nitpick, but when you're spending hours looking at these environments, it's frustrating when they're just visually bland to look at. And then, in addition to all that, the moment-to-moment gameplay was also the easiest it had ever been. Right around the time this map came out was when the community was really starting to figure out training as a strategy, and this map having so many wide open spaces to do that in, as well as having PhD Flopper available, makes it so that this is one of the top 2 easiest maps to get high rounds in. While it's fun for a while to have a relatively stress-free game and just see how high you can go, that lack of challenge starts to get monotonous and boring pretty quickly into a session. But even though, yes, it can get a little bland, I can't fault it because I'll always respect Ascension for what it did with the Easter egg and what it did for the story in general. Since then, every map in the Ether storyline would get more bombastic and confident in its storytelling, and that all stems from the philosophy of Ascension. The inherent joy and sense of satisfaction that comes from solving a puzzle.